Good afternoon. Welcome to this webinar on HITRUST, co-presented by ControlCase and HITRUST. My name is Kishore Vaswani, and I'm the Chief Strategy Officer of ControlCase. I really appreciate the time you've taken today to attend this webinar on this exciting topic of HITRUST and how HITRUST works in the compliance and certification ecosystem. We are very fortunate to have Michael Parisi, Vice President of Adoption at HITRUST, with us. I will turn it over to Mike to introduce himself, and then we'll get going with the webinar.
Great, thank you so much. I appreciate being here today and appreciate the opportunity to present alongside one of our assessor partners in ControlCase. Got a long-standing relationship in the HITRUST space and looking forward to today's discussion. I'm the Vice President of Adoption here at HITRUST. We've got responsibility for many of our strategic programs and helping our organization to stand up new programs to address common security and privacy challenges that our customers are faced with, some of which we will be taking you through today. So thank you.
Great. Thank you, Mike, for the introduction, and thank you again for being here. I think this will be a very valuable webinar to our attendees, our customers, and the HITRUST ecosystem in general. A few housekeeping items before we get started. As we go through the webinar today, please feel free to put questions in the questions window, and we will make sure we either answer them in this webinar or we get back to you through email for any of the questions that you have asked us on HITRUST or any HITRUST certification and compliance related questions. If you have any problem hearing, please again feel free to put in the chat window, and we will make sure that we are moderating that as well. We expect this webinar to run somewhere in the 30 to 45-minute range. And as I said, as we go along, feel free to put questions in the questions window, and we will make sure we get back to you by email if we are not able to address them in this webinar. So that being said, let's get into our agenda. We're going to be talking a little bit about what is HITRUST at a high level, and then Michael will dive into the specifics of HITRUST certifications, and some new exciting certifications that are now going to be released by HITRUST here in the coming weeks and months. So there are some updates that Michael will talk about. He'll talk about the HITRUST ecosystem in general, how HITRUST is being used in the healthcare industry, and now being really expanded into a more general purpose certification across industries, relying on frameworks like NIST and so forth. We'll then finally get into a high-level control case methodology for HITRUST, and then we'll get into Q&A. So that being said, just a little bit about ControlCase. We are a HITRUST assessor. We are partnered with HITRUST since 2014. We've been fortunate to be doing HITRUST assessments since 2014. We have 50 plus HITRUST customers. We have probably done about 200 plus certifications globally across this base, and we have 15 plus HITRUST external assessors. We at ControlCase, really focus on making sure that we do a good job in doing the HITRUST assessments, but also give our customers visibility and peace of mind that they will go through the process and make sure that they are in the loop the whole time on where they stand in the HITRUST certification process. A little bit about HITRUST. It was founded in 2007, really to help companies safeguard sensitive data and manage risk. It really is a certifiable framework. Primarily, that started off in the healthcare industry because there wasn't really a lot of healthcare certifications, and there probably still are not many besides HITRUST that exist out there. Since then, HITRUST focuses on healthcare, but also is become a fairly industry agnostic, across industry certification that exists out there. The objective of HITRUST really is to make sure that the ecosystem of compliance between companies that provide services to their customers, to healthcare companies, and then between organizations flows in a streamlined manner. It really delivers a scalable and certifiable process from an information security certification perspective to ensure that the ecosystem of technology across the healthcare industry and general purpose industry is streamlined, and it also provides a framework for providing a certification in the end, which HITRUST provides as part of its CSF program. HITRUST CSF, you'll hear of that. That is the certifiable framework. It harmonizes multiple standards, including HIPAA, obviously, which is very important for healthcare, but also other regulations like SOC and ISO 27001. The HITRUST CSF framework really has defined a process to efficiently and effectively evaluate compliance and security risks across the organization. And again, for companies that engage an assessor like ControlCase, we would work with the CSF framework and go through an eventual HITRUST certification process. Some of the key components of the CSF Assurance Program, irrespective of whether you use an assessor or not, is there's certainly the actual content, the tools, and the technology that talk about the different regulations, that talk about the different requirements mapped to multiple regulations. And so those standardized tools and processes are a good method for companies to implement an enterprise-wide security framework. On top of that, companies can use an independent assessor like ControlCase to actually evaluate against the CSF framework within the MyCSF tool and get a certification towards the end. And finally, before I turn it over to Michael, I'm not going to go through all of these, but we're going to be sending a copy of these slides to all the participants and also publishing them. These are the 19 high-level domains that are there in HITRUST. A lot of you from the information security and compliance world would resonate well with one or multiple of these domains, and I'm sure you have run into many of these domains in the past. So that's a very high-level introduction to HITRUST. We are fortunate to have Michael, who will now talk about the details of HITRUST, some of the exciting new changes that are coming up, some new certifications that are coming up, and how HITRUST works as a whole. Michael, over to you. Thank you again for joining us, and I will turn this presentation over to you now.
Great, thank you, Kishore. So if you don't mind moving us to the next slide, I think that was a great overview from a programmatic perspective, and certainly all the engagement that you and ControlCase have had within the HITRUST ecosystem for a number of years now. So thank you for that. As Kishore mentioned, we're really excited to talk about some of the new enhancements and strategic programs that we are releasing into the marketplace, for which a partner like ControlCase will be in a position to guide you through, very similar to what they've done throughout the years around our other assurance mechanisms. But what I'd like to start with is give the audience an appreciation of some of the research that we have done over the last several months that has led us to the release of some of these new strategic programs. Before we do that, let's talk about this concept of assurances. Everything that we do from a programmatic perspective is really designed to help organizations address these common security and privacy challenges in the most efficient and effective way possible. And as you listen to us today and go along this journey with us, I'd encourage you to look at this through two different lenses. Many of us are what we refer to as assessed entities, right? So we are organizations that are looking to provide assurances to different stakeholders within the marketplace. And we are providing those assurances either because we're being asked to or required to, or we're looking for ways to differentiate ourselves within the marketplace. And what's important is when we decide how we are going to provide those assurances, we want to make sure that the mechanism that we use and the means by which we do so allows for those assurances to be credible and to have the highest level of reliability. Let's talk about some instances as to why we would need to provide assurances, or where us as assessed entities are being asked to provide assurances. Those could be internal drivers. For example, some of the things that we have on the slide here Maybe our board is asking us, what are you doing to address common cyber threats? How do we know that you have appropriate security and privacy programs in place? Our fellow members of senior management, certainly our customers externally, and regulators are asking us to provide assurances, in many instances, validated assurances, right? That somebody like a ControlCase has come in and done an independent validation around your programs in order to satisfy their asks. And then there's other use cases as well. If you think about investors or shareholders, oftentimes they want to know, what is that organization doing to protect their investment in that organization and to make sure that they have appropriate security and privacy programs in place. And then some other things to think outside the box. You think about cyber insurers and cyber underwriters. We're seeing a movement within that space whereby in order for organizations to obtain cyber insurance or to ensure that their premiums don't increase significantly, they need to provide some type of validated assurance relative to their security and privacy programs. The challenge that most assessed entities face is that this oftentimes creates a number of one-off or proprietary information security questionnaires or assessments that they need to complete in order to satisfy these stakeholders. So we're focused on helping organizations to do this more efficiently, more effectively, and really implement this concept of assess once and report many. If you change your hat for a second and think about relying parties, why are they asking for assurances, right? Why are they requiring it? For a number of different reasons, everything that we talked about before, to make sure that those third parties have appropriate security and privacy programs in place. Oftentimes, that is due to some type of contractual requirement or regulation. But what's really important for them is to make sure they've got an appropriate level of transparency and consistency relative to those assurances that they are asking for. We like to refer to this as buyer beware. If you are a relying party, be careful about what you're requesting or requiring from your third parties or what you're receiving to make sure it's giving you the right level of visibility and reliability into those programs. And if you think about the pain point around a series of proprietary information security questionnaires and audits, that's a giant pain point for a relying party as well. It's very expensive, very time intensive in order to support that. So the ideal situation for a relying party is to accept an appropriate third-party assurance report in place of executing those proprietary procedures. And Kishore, I don't know if you have anything to add. I know you're in this space every day on the front lines. Any other perspective that you would give the audience?
Yeah, no, thanks. That touched on all the different vectors. I can second the fact that absolutely companies are looking for that assurance for all the reasons we mentioned, and increasingly the board of directors, security, and making sure you have the certification has become a board level issue.
Sure, right. Great. So as we move on to the next slide, so knowing that there is this need for organizations to provide assurances, and there is a need for organizations to obtain requests to require assurances, like I like to say, not all assurances are equivalent. And what we've spent the last year to 18 months doing is looking at all the different assurance mechanisms that exist within the marketplace, for which Kishore and ControlCase are very familiar with, because they help organizations with all these different types of assessments. And we looked at what are the attributes that define these different assurance mechanisms. And we really focused on the suitability of the controls that are considered as part of those assessments, and then also the rigor of the approach or the process that is executed in order to provide those assurances. And we found that these are all the different combinations driven off of the level of controls. So for example, is it a proprietary set of controls that just management selects in support of a self-attestation? Is it defined and rooted within an industry recognized standard? Or is it tailorable, driven off of risk and industry recognized standards as you move along the continuum? In addition to the attributes focused on the approach, probably the easiest example to reference and understand is the difference between something that is a self-attestation versus something that has a level of validation. When we think about this concept of comfort and reliability, we're going to get a higher level of reliability and comfort from something that is validated by an independent, objective, qualified organization like ControlCase than something that is just, say, a questionnaire executed by management without some level of independent validation. And lastly, is there another checkpoint whereby an independent, objective, certifying body is in a position to not only look at what management has done within that organization, but also look at what that assessor or that auditing organization has done, such as ControlCase, that they are in a position to ultimately produce a certification to the extent that it meets minimum necessary requirements. So knowing that those are all the different attributes that are associated with various assurance mechanisms, everything from, again, say a SIG questionnaire to maybe an ISO certification, SOC 2 report, PCI, or a HITRUST assessment or certification, where do most of these assurance mechanisms land? And I'm sure if you move us to the next slide, you'll see that in our research and plotting all these different assurance mechanisms and really understanding the difference between all of them over the last several months, we find that they generally fall within this range. You have a subset of assurance mechanisms that are certainly self-attestations or provide what we refer to as a low level of assurance, certainly defined by the fact that there is no validation, but there's usually a limited breadth and a limited scope associated with those. And they're often very simple or basic. Think of it as having a peek under the hood in terms of what's going on at an organization, as opposed to a full diagnostic review, for example. A lot of different mechanisms that fall within that quadrant. The other extreme is there's also a lot of mechanisms that fall within the high level of assurance quadrant. Probably the one that's at the highest of the list is a full HITRUST certification, or what we're now referring to as an R2. We'll get into that a little bit later on in the presentation. And maybe mechanisms such as, a SOC 2 report over all the principles. And then as you move down the line to a moderate level, that's where maybe an ISO comes into play. However, what we found is that that moderate level of assurance is that there was really an unaddressed need from the market. And when most organizations choose what assurance mechanism or report they're going to do, or if organizations are thinking about what they're going to require their third parties or business partners to do, oftentimes they need to either round up or round down, right? And a good example is that a lot of organizations will hold their vendors or their business partners to a certain level that is the equivalent of, like I like to say, killing a mosquito with a cannon, right? It's way too big of a lift or an ask for that organization to complete, and it may not align directly with the risk profile or relationship with that particular third party. So we saw a need to address this concept of moderate level of assurances. And as we looked within our own portfolio, we recognized we really didn't have a mechanism in place to satisfy that. And as we looked across the marketplace, we also recognized that there weren't a lot of options to satisfy that, and the ones that did exist did not have a high level of reliability and quality. So, Kishore, as we move to the next slide, what that really allowed us to do is to say we need to come up with a mechanism that fits within our assurance portfolio, but provides a broader range of options and assurance that addresses that moderate assurance level that the market really needed. And how do we do that in such a way that we raise the bar across the continuum from a quality perspective and from a validation perspective, which is where we have introduced some new assurance mechanisms and a new type of certification that we're referring to as an I1 that helps organizations move along the assurance continuum. Kishore, if we go to the next slide, we can dive into that a little more. As a quick reminder, this is what our assessment portfolio looks like today. Those of you not familiar with a rapid assessment, that's that low level of assurance self-attestation that only lives within our third-party risk management platform that we refer to as the HITRUST Assessment Exchange, our managed service area. But most organizations are familiar with the CSF readiness assessment and the full validated assessment. And what those are focused on, as Kishore mentioned in the beginning, think of it as the full complement of requirements and also authoritative sources that may or may not be relevant to an organization that can tailor it based upon the risk profile of that organization. Sure, as we move to the next slide, what we were missing, again, is these moderate levels of assurance or higher level of quality, low level of assurance assessment as well, which is why we have introduced what we refer to as the basic assessment and the I-1 assessment. Our traditional HITRUST certification will still remain. There's many use cases and needs for that level of assessment. It is being renamed an R2, risk-based 2-year assessment. Our traditional certification is good for 2 years, as long as there's not an overall degradation within the control environment or significant changes. And it does start with the full framework. And it starts with a full risk assessment in order to tailor that framework down to what is relevant to that organization or what's being assessed. But the I-1 provides organizations is still a certification, and it is still a validated assessment. So your assessor partner, like ControlCase, will still go through and execute testing to give you that highest level of reliability and validation, but it will only be focused on the highest risk element of implementation. For those of you familiar with our process and our methodology, the full R2 certification requires organizations to be assessed against policy, procedure, implementation, and whether they are measuring or managing their programs. Along the lines of implementation, that is traditionally the highest risk area. I'm more concerned if a business partner of mine is not actually executing a control and has that in place than to address a potential vulnerability or threat, as opposed to if they have it written down or documented from a policy perspective. So this certification will only focus on whether controls are actually implemented within the organization, but will still come with those multiple levels of quality assurance review, not only management's attestation, everything that the assessor partner is doing, but also HITRUST as a certifying body as well. The basic assessment has been designed to understand good security hygiene within an organization. It's a step up from what is currently the rapid assessment. And the rapid assessment, as I mentioned before, is only available to organizations participating in the exchange. The basic assessment will be available to the entire community. And that does come with a level of automated validation through our AI engine from an assessment perspective. So although it is not the same level of comfort and reliability as having an independent assessor validate it, it will come with some level of validation. And it's designed for those smaller, lower risk organizations or relationships, not only from a relying party perspective, but certainly from an assessed entity standpoint as well. And the basic assessment and the I-1 will be available for organizations to execute starting 1/1 of 2022. And we have several organizations that are actually piloting the process right now from a scoping perspective and from a readiness standpoint. So, Kishore, if you can move us to the next slide, let's dive into this a little bit more. I want to spend a few minutes here and zoom out a minute as we talk about, what are the different attributes that we should be thinking about as it relates to third-party assurance mechanisms more broadly. And the way that we see the equation is that we ultimately want the highest level of reliability as it relates to assurances that we are receiving from our stakeholders, or providing the highest level of reliability to our stakeholders as it relates to assurances. Why? Because it reduces some additional questions or areas of doubt that we may have, driven off of limitations from some assurance mechanisms that exist. For example, if we think about transparency, probably one of the most important things that we should be focused on Again, we title this Buyer Beware. If we look at it through the lens of an individual that is receiving assurance reports from third parties, trying to understand, how good is this organization's information security program? Do they have exceptions or issues or opportunities for improvement that I may want to ask more questions about, or I may want to monitor more closely? If you don't have the appropriate level of data, you won't be in a position to understand where some of those vulnerabilities or where some of that risk exists. Some assurance mechanisms that exist in the marketplace today, for example, will certainly tell you whether there are, quote, exceptions noted, unquote, or no exceptions noted, or tell you whether there are, again, corrective action plans, but it may not provide you with a data set relative to the maturity of a security program. As we know, compliance doesn't equal security program maturity overall. So we're trying to really expand the horizon to say you need both. You need to understand, are there issues that exist, but you also want to know how mature is that program. Something like a SOC 2, for example, doesn't give you that level of visibility. It's only going to tell you whether there are exceptions in place or not. It's not going to tell you how mature that program is, which is why something like a HITRUST assessment through an additional data set of the PRISM scoring will give you that visibility. Other examples would be if you think about subservice organizations or vendors of your vendors, making sure that you've got full visibility into the risk associated with the service that that business partner is providing you is really important. So when you have assurance mechanisms, again, like a SOC report and others that allow for this concept of carve-outs, you may not be getting the full picture because there are aspects of that service that are executed by another provider. So now you got to go track down that other provider's information in order to put together the full picture. Leveraging assurance mechanisms like HITRUST assessments, where the equivalent of the inclusive method is either required or allowed, and the ability to inherit scores from those subservice organizations give you better visibility along the supply chain or the assurance continuum. Other aspects around making sure you have an appropriate level of accuracy in addition to consistent reporting all leads to this concept of reliability. And lastly, on the integrity side, again, making sure you're working with a partner if you are an assessed entity, or if you are a reliant party, knowing that an appropriate partner has done the right level of validation, such as ControlCase, is really important. You want to understand what is the integrity behind the process that has been executed. Those combined together give you the highest level of reliability from an assurance mechanism. Kishore, anything to add there?
No, I think the four pillars that you have here, which is transparency, consistency, integrity, and accuracy, that's what the industry is looking for. And maybe the only thing to add here is that the HITRUST CSF dashboard actually has, the dashboard actually addresses a lot of it at a high level for executive management as well.
Sure. Oh, great point. So if you could move us along to the next slide, now that we've gone through this journey of understanding why assurances are needed, why they're being produced, we understand that there are different mechanisms out there that are not created equal. We understand a need for varying levels of assurance. And lastly, we understand the attributes that should exist for an appropriate assurance mechanism. Let's give you an understanding of what is the assurance continuum as it relates to the HITRUST assurance mechanisms that help support all those attributes that we've talked about. An important thing to note and why we have it structured this way is that they build upon each other. So if an organization is just getting started to say, I need to understand, do I have good security hygiene in place? Even if it's starting with the self-attestation, how do I start somewhere in order to provide a level of comfort and assurance internally to my stakeholders or externally? The idea would be a basic assessment could be a great place to start. As you move along the continuum, the requirements are nested, meaning as you move into an I-1, the requirements that you would have assessed against from a programmatic perspective in the basic assessment, you build upon those in order to achieve the next level of security maturity and be in a position to show that you not only have good security hygiene, but you are in alignment with leading security practices. Think of this as an industry agnostic approach. This is what the I-1 provides you as one of those new assurance mechanisms. Some major differences between the I-1 and the R2 is the I-1 is a stagnant set of controls, approximately 200-ish controls that organizations will have to assess against. All organizations assess against the same set of controls. Why do we do it that way? Well, one, we're trying to, again, lessen the burden between an R2 and an I-1 and recognize that some organizations are never going to need the level of assurance that an R2 provides, but they are going to have to produce assurances over an appropriate security program. Authoritative sources, such as ones that are identified across many industries, like NIST 800-171 is fully covered, in addition to a number of other authoritative sources, are addressed through the scope of an I-1. Remember, it is a certification. It is valid for 1 year, and it's also focused on just implementation. However, you must still use an external assessor in order to provide that level of validation against implementation, and it follows the same assurance process as our R2 does, going through our quality assurance program in order to ultimately produce a certification. I would encourage you, just like most organizations do with the R2 today, to follow the same timeline, process, and life cycle that you would for a full certification with the I-1. And I think Kishore is going to talk about, how does ControlCase do that effectively for their customers. But that readiness step is really, really important. And having what I like to refer to as a facilitated readiness, having an assessor partner with you at the beginning, like ControlCase, is really important to ensuring a greater chance of success for an ultimate certification. On the left-hand side, these are just some thematical points that differentiate HITRUST assessments over other assurance mechanisms and assessments that exist within the marketplace, some of which I've already highlighted, but things such as having that ability to inherit, the fact that you can assess once, report many, and then also have all assessments subject to our new AIE or Assurance Intelligence Engine, really just increases the ultimate level of reliability. We'll talk about the new report results distribution system as we move a little further along in the discussions. Kishore, I think that brings us to the next slide, please. And this is just some more summary information around the differences between the assurance mechanisms. What I will draw your attention to is if you look at the evaluation approach, and if we focus on the I-1 for a second, notice it's a 1x5, right? So it's focused on one element, which is implementation, but there's still this concept of partial credit that exists within the R2 or the full certification. On the R2, those of you familiar with it, most organizations will focus only on the 3x5, which is policy, procedure, and implementation. But some organizations do look across all 5 elements, which will include whether organizations are measuring and managing their programs. If you look at the targeted coverage, this is an important thing to point out. If you are an organization that needs to provide assurances over multiple authoritative sources, the I-1 may not be a good option for you. For example, if you need to ensure full HIPAA compliance against HIPAA security, privacy, and breach notification, you won't get that full level of compliance and assurance from an I-1. You'll certainly get comfort around implementation from a security rule perspective, but for those of you familiar with HIPAA, you do know policy and procedure is a key element as it relates to the OCR audit protocols and expectations, and R2 is still going to be the answer for you. If you need to provide compliance around other authoritative sources, for example, specifically full coverage over NIST 853, again, the I-1 is not going to provide you that level of comfort. That is one major decision point that organizations have when they're trying to determine what level of assurance they produce. And then lastly, that relative level of effort. If you notice, the I-1 is roughly 20% of the level of effort of an R2. Why? It's only looking at 1 out of the 5 elements, and it is a smaller control set as opposed to the control set that most organizations are subject to in an R2. So it can be done quicker, it can be done cheaper, but still provides a higher level of reliability as it relates to the most important risk element of implementation. Kishore, I think we can move to the next one. And here, and Kishore, I think you're going to guide us through how ControlCase looks at this process from an assessment standpoint related to HITRUST.
Yeah, thank you, Michael. I appreciate that. And, I think it's very exciting that for the new certification. I know there are a lot of companies that would benefit immensely from the new certification, which does look at the implementation procedures, as you mentioned earlier. It's about 20%, it's a little bit lesser controls. It's a good stepping stone to the full assessment, which is certainly needed for a higher level of comfort. But I know a lot of our customer base is looking forward to something like this as well. For folks who have not been HITRUST certified and want to start working towards it will really benefit from the new certification. I want to talk about what is ControlCase's methodology on the HITRUST R2 assessment. So keep in mind, this would be the R2 assessment that exists currently, which, the number of controls could be anywhere from 200 to 2,000, depending on how the scoping happened. So our process really is very streamlined from start to end to make sure that we are providing a good assessment, an accurate assessment, while ensuring that the customer's cybersecurity program benefits overall from it. The early step really is to get we ask the customer to provide us with access to their My CSF subscription. That is really a prerequisite for us getting started with this assessment. We then would guide you to our customers toward building the scoping and building what is applicable from a requirements perspective. Now, at a high level, we have two independent teams within ControlCase that are involved in this overall process. In the early stages, which is step number 2, we have a readiness team who is working iteratively with you as the customer to ensure that you are uploading and verifying that all the controls that you're uploading really satisfy the HITRUST CSF requirements, across all 5 domains: policy, procedure, implementation, and so on. So the readiness assessor would also guide you as to what is the expected evidence that's required within the portal, how to interpret some of these regulations, the state regulatory statements, and how the overall cybersecurity kind of posture is for the company as it goes through its journey of making sure they are completing their My CSF data points before an audit starts. So the readiness team and the readiness assessor will guide and make sure that they work with the customer all the way through a populated, auditable CSF subscription. Now, once that's done, we ask you as a customer to purchase the validated assessment. At that point, the readiness assess team is no longer working with you. It is an independent HITRUST assessor who gets into the audit phase, and they would actually start auditing the information you as a customer have uploaded to make sure it meets, really from an audit perspective, and verifying that it is accurate and it meets the requirement for each of the requirements that exist out there. Typically it would be a 2-month audit process. We do typically have the outer timeline is 3 months. An average timeline is probably 2 months, 6 weeks to 2 months for that audit process. After that, that is then, certainly looked at it from a ControlCase quality assurance perspective. And then once we feel comfortable that the audit was done properly, we then really submit it to HITRUST. There's a HITRUST quality assurance process that then kicks in. If there are questions on the submission, HITRUST would reach out to us. We might reach back to the customer In some cases, we might have the answers that HITRUST asks. In some cases, we will come back to you as a customer for some questions if there were some points that were raised. After that happens, then we go ahead and it passes through the QA process, and the end result would be either a validated report or a certified report at the end of it. So at a high level, these are the 6 high-level stages that ControlCase uses across 2 teams, 2 independent teams. One is readiness, one is the audit team, to take a customer in its My CSF journey from subscription to a final certified or validated report. This gives you, across the phases, just a high level, a very average certification plan, right? So there are companies that can probably, who have done it in the past, may be able to do it quicker than 8 months. There are certainly companies that take north of a year sometimes when they are working towards a program. But, an average project plan across the phases would look something like this. And, it can be overlaid with the 6 phases I showed earlier. Michael talked about the I-1 assessment, which I said is really the new assessment that's coming up. About 20% of the effort in terms of the number of controls. However, it is, there's certainly the controls have to be working, and there needs to be evidence for all of them. So the level of assurance, though moderate, is still a fairly significant level of assurance that will come through the I-1 assessments. We estimate that our estimate is that instead of the 8 months that we looked on an average, we think this could be done end-to-end process of 5 months. Keep in mind that what this also does is that after an I-1, if you go for an R2 in the future, as you mature your program, it really builds on that. So it's not a new assessment. A lot of the controls have been looked at in I-1, and R2 will add on top of that. Our overall approach is very similar. We'll have a readiness team all the way through getting the actual audit subscription, and then the audit team will make sure we have looked at the 200 plus requirements, and then we would submit to HITRUST just the way we do for an R2 assessment. That being said, let me really turn it back to Michael to talk and get us home on the remaining presentation.
Great, thank you, Kishore. So, now that we've had a discussion around, again, the needs for assurances, where does the new assurance mechanisms fit within our overall portfolio, and you've heard a great process that ControlCase has in place to help organizations not only through the current assessments, but they've already built a process for the new assessments. So well ahead of the game in terms of what needs to be done to help organizations down this path. Now let's pivot to the last piece of today's discussion, and it's this concept of sharing assurances. There's a lot of challenges, and I'm not talking about just HITRUST reports. I'm talking about really any type of assurance report that exists out there, whether it be SOC reports, ISO certifications, PCI, and certainly HITRUST reports as well. There's a lot of challenges in requesting and sharing these assurance reports, and also things associated with ensuring that they are authentic. How do we do this more efficiently and more effectively? So to give you an appreciation of what it looks like today, oftentimes it's highly manual, and usually through email or some type of relying party is asking a third party, right, or an assessed entity to provide what they have in the form of assurances or assurance reports. That relying party usually spends many cycles trying to get somebody to respond. That's assuming that they're actually going to the right person to get that information appropriately. As that assessed entity gets several requests, sometimes hundreds, not thousands of those requests, those are all individual requests that they need to respond to, determine what they need to share back, what can't be shared back, etc. Now, once the relying party actually gets that report, Oftentimes the reports are not easy to work with. They could be locked down. The presentation of those reports could vary significantly. If you think about different types of assurance reports, the data that we're trying to get to quickly in order to make better informed decisions oftentimes is buried within these reports. There's a lot of fluff and information that may not be that relevant to us. We just need to get to what are the issues? What are the corrective action plans? What's the scope? That exists in many different places and varying places across these reports, and it's very manual in order to go and determine where that information is. Once we've identified where that information is, oftentimes we need to get it out of this protected report so we can analyze it more seamlessly. Most organizations do this through, say, a GRC module or maybe a VRM tool. And again, it becomes a very manual process in order to get that information or even get us to the point where we can start consuming those assurances and those data elements to make better informed decisions. And this process repeats time and time again. There's a lot of things that can go wrong with this equation, and they do go wrong in terms of how the process is built today. So Kishore, maybe if you take us to the next slide for a second. Let's talk about the different things that can go wrong. And I won't go through all of these in detail, but to give you an appreciation, how many times are organizations maybe sharing more than they need to share? The fact that we have an assurance report, this happens a lot for us within the HITRUST space. Organizations may not want to share the full HITRUST report. There's a lot of sensitive information in there. But they know that their customer, their clients need something more than just the letter of certification. Today, there's not a lot of flexibility to share certain pieces or information within the report or to really draw the attention of their relying parties to those controls that are most relevant or those corrective action plans that are most relevant. If I'm a relying party, a lot of times I'm overlooking certain things that may be important. I'm just buried with so much information and so many reports that I may not realize things that are indicators of risk that I should actually be paying attention to. Same thing with the validity of these reports. Are they still within a time period that's relevant to me? I may overlook that. It's very hard to validate that. Or more importantly, is the report authentic? One of the things, unfortunately, that we've seen an increase within the marketplace with are fraudulent assurance reports, right? And if I'm a relying party, I think we take that for granted. Right? We're all good people. We like to think that somebody isn't trying to push something over to us that isn't a real report. However, it does happen. So taking that extra step in order to validate whether it's authentic or not is oftentimes something that organizations don't do. And if they do it, it just bogs down the process even further in order to determine whether it is a valid report or not. Number of different things that can go wrong. So what we are trying to do is to change the thought process, right? We're trying to set the stage within this concept of providing assurance reports and change it to say it should be about providing, requesting, and consuming authentic assurance results, right? It's a mind shift. It's a mind change. Let's get away from this concept of reports. Reports are nothing more than a delivery mechanism of results. And let's step ahead to how do we get to the results faster and only the results that are most relevant to us. And how do we get to those that are already validated that we know that are authentic? And how can we interact with a full assessment with just those results that are most relevant to us? And that's what we are solving for with our new program and module that we refer to as the results distribution system. And Kishore, if you can move us to the next slide, let's dig into that for a few minutes. The idea is there's got to be a better way, right? If I am an assessed entity, how can I send an invitation to my stakeholder or my customer to say, Instead of us exchanging emails back and forth and me giving you too much information, maybe more than I want to, or too much information for you to comb through, I'm making your life harder as a relying party to get to the answers that you want. And instead of us spending 3, 4, 5 hours on a call to walk through exactly what you should be focused on, what if I could send you an invitation to my results portal, where you're in a position to interact with all my assessment information directly. You can filter on what's important to you. Maybe you want to know how am I doing relative to risks associated with ransomware? What controls do I have in place? What's the maturity of my ransomware program? Maybe you just want to know, where do I have corrective action plans? Or in the case of a HITRUST assessment, where have I fallen below the minimum necessary threshold, and what are some of the issues? And better yet, how do I arm you as a relying party to be in a position where not only can you interact with this electronically online, get the information that you need quicker, how can you then consume it through an API ecosystem into your system of record, into your GRC platform, into your VRM module, where you're housing all of your information centrally in order to analyze your business partners and your stakeholders. And that is what RDS is going to provide, the ability for assessed entities to share that information and relying parties to consume it much easier and much more seamless than they can today. Kusher, if you can move us to the next slide, please. Give you an appreciation of what we're talking about. Again, think as if it's your own portal that you're interacting with. You want to view on a domain by domain basis. You want to understand what the severity of some of those domain statements are. You want to quickly be able to understand where the gaps are, filter appropriately, and pull that information out. This doesn't mean that downloadable lockdown reports are going away. That's certainly going to be available and will always continue to be available. But again, how do we get to information and results quicker? And how do we eliminate pushing paper back and forth and the need to copy and paste certain data elements into a system of record where we're analyzing our population holistically? If you can move us to the next slide. One of the things that we're doing with this module in this system is we're going to be releasing multiple versions over the next several months and years. We're going to start with a portal and functionality that all HITRUST assessed entities will receive. If you have a HITRUST assessment, you will have the ability to use RDS to share and publish this information through our API ecosystem. And again, regardless of what maybe your subscription tier would be within MyCSF, everyone's going to get this. There's no additional cost. It's an added enhancement that we're giving to all HITRUST customers. In addition to that, we are working very closely, me personally, one of the things I'm charged with this year, in developing integration relationships with all the major GRC providers and VRM systems within the marketplace. Those of you that may have seen our press release on this program in the assessment portfolio may have recognized that Archer, for example, is one of our largest and closest partners that we're working with. So if you are an organization that is leveraging one of these solutions today in order to evaluate your risk, your third-party population, you'll be able to do that more seamlessly through this integration across those platforms. And also think about it, if you are an organization that's responding to requests that may be coming from these systems, you'll be in a position whereby instead of having to respond to all these individual requests, very similar to our mantra of assess once, report many, you'll be able to link your RDS instance and portal directly to all of those requests instead of having to do all those individual responses. So we're really excited about it. If you can move us to the next slide, something that will be coming again in January of 2022. Be on the lookout for more information. Kishore, I think we've got some summary information at the end here as to why leveraging HITRUST assessments, providing the highest level of assurance across the continuum, whether you need low, moderate, or high level of assurance, is a win-win for the entire ecosystem. Any other closing thoughts or comments there?
Yeah, no, this is great. I think I can completely see how the data that an organization has worked fairly hard to put together from a requirements perspective, to the extent it can be used for their business partners, is really something that I think a lot of our customers would find very useful out there. And a lot of times even their business partners or their customers may ask them these questions, and sounds like the RDS system would allow people to get to the data in a more streamlined manner. So that is great. And a lot of times, maybe the only other thing to add is, again, a lot of times, if you're HITRUST certified, HITRUST compliant, cyber insurance premiums we are seeing are better if you are HITRUST compliant or certified to the R2 today, certainly I1 in the future as well. Thank you, Michael, for a really informative presentation. Thank you everybody for attending. There's just a couple of questions we'll answer, and the remaining questions you can email to us, or you can just put it in the questions window, and we will respond back by email. Michael, there's one question maybe you can take, which is for the I1 certification, is the audit time frame similar to R2 of 3 months, or are there any significant differences in that sense? Also, is it sounds like it is an annual certification, consistent annual certification, instead of the major 1 year and then the minor assessment in year 2. So I think the question on I1 would help clarify on if you could provide some clarity on that.
Sure. Yeah, absolutely. So you are right, Kishore, and to answer that question, it is good for 1 year. So it does not extend for 2 years with an interim assessment. So it is something that is executed annually. Everything else stays the same relative to what we refer to as the burn-in or bake-in period. It's not just a point in time. So our assessor partners like ControlCase will look historically, and it will also give you a level of forward-looking assurance as well. And lastly, related to that is we are aligning the controls to the MITRE framework, so we can identify which controls address the most common indicators of compromise and indicators of threats. So it will be another element available to organizations, and that could change over time as that threat landscape changes over time. So organizations will have the ability to adopt, say, what is the most recent control set in future years, aligning to the changes in the threat landscape. But great question.
Great, thank you. I'll take one more question, and I will answer that. The question is on, can one certification, the I1, lead to the R2 in the future? The answer is yes. If you're in an organization that is looking to get certified or validated, certainly having an I1 in year 1 and R2 in year 2 is a viable option, and it might also be the roadmap that you guys might want to select in the future if you want to take it in smaller steps. Certainly, R2 still remains the certification you would need in many cases of assurance. I think Michael mentioned earlier, certainly, for example, HIPAA breach notification requirements, some of the other standards like NIST 853 mappings and so forth still require R2. But if you're looking to get something done a little bit in a baby step towards an R2 and want to get some sort of HITRUST certification, ControlCase's time frame, we expect it to be about 5 months to get the I1. And certainly, you could repeat an I1, or next year you could also progress to an R2. But great question. That's all the time we had today. Michael, thank you again so much. We really value our partnership with HITRUST, and thank you for attending this webinar and giving us all this information. So really appreciate your time.
Great, thank you. It was great being here.
All right. Thank you, everybody, and have a good rest of the day.